Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Waitman's Employment Insights podcast. My name is Patrick Byrne. I'm an associate in our employment team in Manchester. I'm joined today by my colleague Rebecca Kearney, a principal associate in our employment team in Liverpool. Hi,
Hello,
Rebecca. Thanks for
everybody.
joining the podcast.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
So, we all know the general election's really close now. We've got less than 2 weeks to go until the 4th of July. And there's been a lot of coverage and TV debates, but there maybe hasn't been as much of a focus on employment law reforms that the main parties might be planning and committing to in their manifestos. So, which parties are you going to talk to us about today?
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, so I'm going to give a run through of the Labour manifesto first, which is the chunkiest, have got the most information. I'll then cover the Conservative Party. I'll go into a little bit about Reform UK, although there's not a great deal to say there, and also finishing off with the Liberal Democrats.
Great. So, let's talk about Labour. So, what key changes to employment laws might they be proposing?
Yeah, so Labour have promised to introduce legislation within 100 days. And going by the changes that they have set out that are relevant to employment law, I think they're giving themselves an awful lot to do within that first 100 days. It's probably also worth noting that they have pledged to consult with businesses and unions before passing any legislation. So we do suspect that this introduction to legislation within 100 days will just be in a draft form, because as I say, I think they've given themselves an awful lot to do. So firstly, looking at discrimination, they have said they're going to introduce dual discrimination. So rather than having to present two separate claims, for example, for less favourable treatment for disability and sex, they have said that you can put one claim in related to two protected characteristics. They're also going to introduce a Race Equality Act, which is very similar to the equal pay rights that we currently have in place based on gender, but that it will be based on ethnicity, and asking large employers, sort of placing new duties on them to produce ethnicity and disability pay gap reports. So more onus on employers. And also a requirement for employers with more than 250 employees to have a menopause action plan. Now, I don't have a great deal of information about all of these things because obviously they're just lifted from the various manifestos, but we'll have to, I suppose, wait and see what happens next month before knowing or being able to get a bit more detail about any of this. I think the other few points of interest from Labour's perspective is on sort of casual and 0-hour contracts. So they've said that they're going to ban exploitative 0-hour contracts. And the key word there certainly is the word exploitative, because they haven't gone as far as to say that it would be an outright ban. They're also going to introduce a right for employees to have a contract which reflects the hours that they're working. So that will be based on a 12-week reference period, and the right to have a contract based on that. They want to end the practice of fire and rehire, although they again have stopped short of an outright ban on that. And they want to introduce some day one rights, so for sick pay, parental leave, and also for unfair dismissal, which I think is really interesting, although they have said that there will be sort of special status for probationary periods. Again, yet to see what that would look like in practice. But also an extension of tribunal time limits. So all claims at the moment have to be brought within 3 months less a day, and they want to extend that period to 6 months. So very, very employee friendly, I think, is the message here. The other key key point that I wanted to focus on from Labour's perspective was on trade unions and sort of industrial action. So they've said that they're going to make collective redundancy consultation requirements dependent on the number of redundancies across the business as a whole, rather than as it is currently at each establishment. And they want to reverse the changes made under the Trade Union Act 2016, where there was an increased requirement turnout for ballots, more information required on ballot papers, and also of note, I think, for employers, the current 2 weeks notice that needs to be given of a ballot for industrial action, they want to reduce that down to 1. They want to abolish the minimum service levels Act that was brought in 2023, and they want to remove the requirement for fully postal ballots for industrial action, and also make it easier for unions to gain recognition by removing the requirement that 40% of those entitled to vote on recognition need to vote in a ballot for it to be valid. What else do they want to do? They want a right for trade unions to access workplaces for recruitment and organising purposes, which of course they can't do at the moment. And finally, update the requirement for a Section 1 statement that's issued to obviously all new starters to inform staff of their right to join a trade union. So very union friendly, very employee friendly, and lots of onus by the sounds of it on employers. There are a couple of other bits and bobs that they've said, so right to switch off, for example, making flexible working a default right. So lots and lots of information, and as I say, it sounds like they've given themselves a lot to do in that first 100 days, if of course they are, as the polls suggest, the ones to be in power.
Yeah, it sounds like there's some significant changes there. I think one is the day one rights for unfair dismissal would be a big change. Um, and I wonder do you have a view on that in terms of, I think the reference to a possible exception to that for probationary periods is interesting. Would it be prudent for employers, if they aren't already, to make sure they have probationary wording in their contracts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that we always recommend anyway. And I suppose it's yet to see what they propose doing in practice. So whether, if you did need to dismiss somebody early on within their probationary period, whether there would be kind of a retracted process to be able to do that. But obviously then balancing that with more of an onus on employers, given that at the moment they've got this 2-year period before employees have unfair dismissal rights. So definitely something for people to be thinking about. And of course, as soon as we do have more information, if of course it is Labour that take power, then we'll do another podcast setting out kind of the practical implications of all of this as and when it all comes to fruition.
Yeah, that sounds great. Could you tell us a little bit about the Conservatives' approach then, and whether they have any pledges around employment rights?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you'll see here there's a bit of a stark contrast between what Labour have said and what Conservative have said. So much more reserved in terms of what they're saying, obviously with an employment law focus. Um, the clear, I think, message is in relation to cutting taxes. So they want to cut employee national insurance to 6% by April 2027. They want to abolish the main rate of national insurance for the self-employed, and they're committed to not raising income tax or VAT. They've also pledged to maintain the national living wage in each year of the next Parliament at 2/3 of median earnings. And there have been a few questions asked about this. So certainly, for example, where they're saying they're cutting the main rate of national insurance for the self-employed. There's been questions asked about that, about the implications of state pension entitlements, for example. And I think
Yeah.
the pension secretary, work and pension secretary, came out and said that they might still be entitled to a state pension, even with a 0% contribution to national insurance, which I suppose as employees who are paying their national insurance, you might want to have a think about the equity of that maybe. But yeah, certainly a huge focus on cutting taxes. The next thing that they've focused on is this reform of disability benefits. So we did hear Rishi Sunak saying, referring to us having a sick note culture, and he wants to review the way that fit notes are distributed, and he wants to move the responsibility of that from sort of away from GPs and into these specialist work and health professionals, or possibly occupational health professionals. Basically trying to ensure that any assessments are done by professionals who have a specific expertise in occupational health and can really get into the interplay, I suppose, between health conditions and work capabilities. So we'll obviously, if Conservatives take power, see what comes of that. And the other big one, I think, from the Conservatives is they want to change the definition of sex. So they want to set out that they acknowledge biological sex as a reality. And they have said that they've acknowledged, those with differing gender identities, but they are proposing new legislation to amend the definition of sex in the Equality Act, which they have referred to as being outdated. And they also want that to be consistent across the UK, so also including Ireland and Scotland in that. So I suppose it's a case of having to wait and see. I suppose crucially from my perspective, that there was a lot that wasn't in there. So we know that there's been this consultation on the reintroduction of employment tribunal fees, and there was a proposal of a £55 fee for issuing an employment tribunal claim, and also for appealing against decisions of employment tribunals, so to the EAT. So that there was no mention of that in their manifesto. They haven't said anything about that, so we don't know if that's still on the table or not. And also this statutory cap that they'd proposed on non-compete clauses in employee and worker contracts. So they announced that back in May 2023, and I think they'd said that they were going to introduce that when parliamentary time allowed. So that's not come to fruition yet, and again is not in the manifesto. And I did say it would be short and sweet on the Conservatives, but that is the crux of it. As I said, Labour very much in the firing line for employment law and making a load of changes, not so much from the Conservative perspective.
Yeah, I think it's as you would expect for those traditional parties, with lots of employee-friendly proposals from Labour and then less so on the part of the Conservatives. There's two other parties that we want to discuss and their manifestos. Could you tell us a bit about the Reform UK party, and have they committed to anything in terms of employment law reforms?
They have. A bit weird and wonderful, if I'm completely honest. So I suppose that the first anomaly is that they've referred to their manifesto as being a contract rather than an actual manifesto. But what they've said that's relevant to employment law is they want to abolish IR35 in order to better support sole traders. I've got a direct quote here that they've made this general pledge to scrap thousands of laws that hold back British business and damage productivity, including employment laws that make it riskier to hire people. So there's not been any detail as to what laws they are referring to there, but I did think it was a kind of general, a kind of sweeping generalization of wanting to scrap these thousands of laws. And they've actually used the same wording, so they want to scrap EU regulations with immediate effect. Now, obviously, we know that all of the UK laws on employment are based on EU regulations. So again, not entirely clear what they mean by that or what it would mean if they were to come into power. They'd also promised to replace the Equality Act, although it did make me chuckle that they'd referred to it as the Equalities Act. Um, and they want what they've said is that the Equalities Act requires positive action, and that actually it costs the economy billions of pounds. It's actually led to exclusion for some. They think it creates inequality rather than equality, so they want to replace it. Again, no detail at all as to what they want to replace it with or whether it would be replaced at all. So I suppose it's just a case of wait and see what comes of that, if anything.
Yeah, it sounds like a bit of a regulatory bonfire there.
Yes.
So I think the last party we wanted to touch on are the Liberal Democrats, and this Ed Davies party. Have they been sort of active in setting out employment law proposals and wanting to make reforms?
Yeah, a few key points actually from them. So the Liberal Democrats have said they want to establish a new dependent contractor employment status. And I did think this again was a little bit strange because they've said it would fall somewhere between an employee and a self-employed contractor, and that this dependent contractor would have rights such as national minimum wage, they would have sick pay, and they would have holiday entitlement. But of course, we already have a worker, or
Mm,
that falls seems to encompass that already. So I don't know how this dependent contractor would differentiate from the current worker status. So that was one thing that they've pledged, but we would have to wait and see and get a bit more detail as to what that involved. They want to again introduce some day one rights. So they want to introduce statutory sick pay from day one, and also remove the lower earnings limit for access to that. They want to make parental leave and parental pay a day one right, and they want to, and I think this is quite significant, double statutory maternity pay and statutory paternity pay to
gosh.
£350 per week. Kind of sticking with the family-friendly leave, they want to introduce a kind of use it or lose it. So a paid leave month for fathers and partners that would be paid at 90% of salary to try and encourage them to take more time off when there's presumably when there's been a birth of a child or adoption of a child. And again, they want to require large employers to publish data on pay gaps and progression. So that would be not only on gender, but also ethnicity, disability, LGBTQ, etc. And for employers to essentially publish their 5-year plan for dealing with any pay gaps, dealing with any gaps in progression, and hitting their diversity targets. And then finally, they want to improve disability support within employment. So they want to simplify the access to work scheme, which I think would actually be music to employers' ears, to be honest. Anybody who's ever had to deal with the access to work process, it's very long-winded, it can be complex. It can take a long time to get any support through that. So I do think that's a good thing. And also the introduction of adjustment passports that would essentially, if there's an employee with a disability who needs reasonable adjustments making to their role, the passport would record that. So any adjustments, any modifications, any specialist equipment they might need, and they would be able to move that passport from different employers, so it would stay with them the whole time. And similarly with equipment, so if somebody needs modified equipment, that would stay with them throughout their, I suppose, employment journey if they were to move employers. No information on how that, I suppose, would work in practice in terms of funding or payments for that equipment, but nevertheless, there we have it.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a real push from the Lib Dems on assisting people with illnesses and also supporting carers as well.
Yeah. Yes, they did have there was actually something in the Lib Dem manifesto as well, actually, that said that they would introduce a new Equality Act protected characteristic of caring. There's no detail of that. So I won't go into it any further, but yeah, interesting point.
Yeah, yeah. I think as with all of these, we'll have to wait to see who gets into power and what the details are.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think it's stark contrast between some of them, as expected.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Mm.
Well, thank you very much for that summary. Um, it was a lot of ground to cover, but I think that's a really handy whistle-stop tour for everyone of what the election might have in store, not just for employers, but employees as well. If you're interested in receiving more employment law updates like this, please subscribe to our podcast channel, Employment Law Insights. If you need help with anything specific in the employment law and HR world, then please reach out to myself by email at patrick.byrne@waitmans.com, or you can contact Rebecca at rebecca.kearney@waitmans.com. We hope you enjoyed the podcast and thank you for listening.
Thank you, everybody.